Hello and welcome to Lesson 7.4A. I've entitled this video, The Fight for Freedom. This video is going to cover pages 443 to 446. Abolitionism. In the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson had written that all men are created equal. Yet many Americans, including Jefferson himself, did not believe that this statement applied to enslaved African Americans. A growing number of reformers began to think differently. Question number 1. Why were the words of Thomas Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence not exactly how things worked in America during the early portion of our history? Well, we had slavery, and that completely contradicts that all men are created equal. What form did early opposition to slavery take? Jefferson, owner of a slave plantation, may not have believed in the equality of whites and African Americans, but he did believe slavery should be ended. He wrote as much in his draft of the Declaration of Independence. The passage, which was later removed, criticized the existence of, quote, a market where men should be bought and sold. You can see that part right here. Feel free to pause the video if you want to read his whole part that was struck out eventually with the Declaration of Independence. So number 2, Jefferson's views on slavery. He felt it should be ended. In 1777, the Constitution of the new state of Vermont banned slavery. 3 years later, the Massachusetts Constitution did the same, with the words, all men are born free and equal. In the years that followed, other northern states enacted policies aimed at eventually ending slavery. So now we can answer a couple questions. Number 3, what did the Vermont Constitution do about slavery in 1777? It banned slavery. Question number 4, what did the Massachusetts Constitution do about slavery in 1880? It did the same thing, and it included the words, all men are born free and equal. Religious beliefs led some Americans to oppose slavery. Since colonial times, Quakers had taught that it was a sin for one human being to own another. All people, they said, were equal in the sight of God. Benjamin Franklin, who owned 2 slaves, had a change of heart about slavery. He joined an early abolitionist society in Pennsylvania that was founded by Quakers. Later, during the Second Great Awakening, ministers such as Charles Grandison Finney called on Christians to join a massive effort to stamp out slavery. Question number 5. What was the first religious group to oppose slavery? The Quakers. Number 6. During the Second Great Awakening, what religion began to speak out against slavery too? The Christians, or Christianity. In the North, with the population in 1800 of 50,000 enslaved African Americans, slavery was not very important to the economy. As growing numbers of Northerners opposed it, slavery gradually came to an end in the North. By 1804, all the states from Pennsylvania through New England had ended slavery or promised to free their enslaved African Americans over time. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 had banned slavery in the Northwest Territory, which became the Midwestern states north of the Ohio River and east of the Mississippi River, a state like Illinois that we live in today. In 1807, Congress voted to end the slave trade. No more Africans could be enslaved and brought into the country. And now we can answer question 8. What important decision did on slavery did Congress make in 1807? They voted to end the slave trade. That meant you could no longer go to Africa and capture and kidnap slaves and bring them to this country. That didn't stop slavery in this country, or that you could not have slaves in this country create more slaves. But you could not go to Africa and enslave anymore. These efforts to end slavery had little effect in the South, with its nearly 1 million slaves. In fact, the South was growing ever more dependent on slavery. As you have learned, plantation agriculture expanded rapidly in the South in the early 1800s. As a result, there was little support in the South for ending slavery. And as you can see in this chart, it clearly shows that. So here's the number of slaves, and notice this is cotton production, and notice when Eli Whitney's cotton gin takes place, notice what happens. The growth of cotton dramatically increases, but also notice the rise of slavery also increases as well. The colonization movement. The American Colonization Society proposed to end slavery by setting up an independent colony in Africa for Africans and African Americans who had gained freedom from slavery. In 1822, President Monroe helped the society set up a colony in Western Africa, located right here. This colony gained control over a territory that later became the nation of Liberia. Some African Americans favored colonization, believing that they would never have equal rights in the United States. Most, however, opposed the movement. Nearly all, enslaved or free, had been born in the United States. They wanted to stay in their homeland. In the end, only a few thousand African Americans settled in Liberia. So now we can answer question 9. What was the main idea behind the American Colonization Society? The main idea was that, unfortunately, they didn't see a future for African Americans being treated equally, so they felt, let's set up a colony back in Africa, give them a place to go where they can have their equal rights again. And so they set up this area in Africa called Liberia. Number 10, why was the American Colonization Society not much of a success? Well, most African Americans at that time, whether they were free or enslaved, had been born in our country, and they wanted to stay here and just be treated as a human being and equal like they should have been all along. How did abolitionism gain momentum? A growing number of reformers, known as abolitionists, wanted to end slavery completely in the United States. Some abolitionists favored a gradual end to slavery. They expected slavery to die out as if it was kept out of the Western territories. Other abolitionists demanded that slavery end everywhere at once. Almost all abolitionists were Northerners. The abolitionist movement gradually gained strength from the 1820s through the 1840s. It grew more quickly during the 1850s. Question number 11. What was the main goal of abolitionists? The main goal of abolitionists was to end slavery in America forever and completely. Number 12. Most abolitionists were from which part of the country? The North. They were Northerners. A forceful voice for ending slavery was John Quincy Adams. A diplomat for many years, Adams served as president from 1824 to 1828. In the 1830s, he won election to the House of Representatives. There, he proposed a constitutional amendment that would eventually end slavery by declaring all newborn children free. A few years earlier, however, Southern members of Congress had agreed to abide by a, quote, gag rule. They would not discuss anything having to do with slavery. As a result, Adams's proposal was ignored. Question 13. What action did John Quincy Adams take to fight against slavery? Well, in the House of Representatives, he proposed a constitutional amendment that would eventually end slavery by declaring all newborn children free. Question 14. What was the gag rule? The gag rule was a rule that Congress set up where they would not talk about slavery because they knew it was such a divisive issue, an issue that could tear the country apart. They felt it was best not to talk about it at all. So they set up this informal gag rule, which meant we're not going to talk about, vote on any issue with slavery. African American abolitionists. Free African Americans played a key role in the abolitionist movement by actively challenging the existence of slavery. Some tried to end slavery through lawsuits and petitions. In the 1820s, Samuel Cornish and John Russwurm set up an abolitionist newspaper, Freedom's Journal. They hoped to turn public opinion against slavery by printing stories about the brutal treatment of enslaved African Americans. And now we can answer question number 15. What was the main message or theme of the newspaper Freedom's Journal? Well, the main message was that slavery needed to be eliminated, and the way they went that route is they printed stories about the brutal treatment of slaves, trying to get people to understand just how horrible it was, to turn public opinion, which leads us to number 16. What is public opinion? Well, it's defined in the back of your book as the views held by people in general, meaning it's the general feeling of the American people on a particular topic. Other African American abolitionists called for stronger measures. In an appeal to the colored citizens of the world, David Walker encouraged enslaved African Americans to free themselves by any means necessary. Primary source, David Walker, Walker's Appeal, 1829. Now, I ask you, had you not rather be killed than be a slave to a tyrant who takes the life of your mother, wife, and dear little children? Look upon your mother, wife, and children, and answer God Almighty, and believe this, that it is no more harm for you to kill a man who is trying to kill you than it is for you to take a drink of water when thirsty. Question 17. What actions did David Walker call for in the fight against slavery? He was telling African Americans to take whatever means necessary. If that meant violence, so let it be. Walker's friend, Maria Stewart, also spoke out against slavery. Stewart was the first American woman to make public political speeches. Question 18. Why do you think Maria Stewart's name was mentioned in the text? Her name was mentioned because she was the first American woman to make public political speeches. Good for her, using her voice. Frederick Douglass. The best-known African-American abolitionist was Frederick Douglass. Douglass was born into slavery in Maryland. As a child, he defied the slave codes by learning to read. Douglass escaped in 1838 and made his way to New England. One day, at an anti-slavery meeting, he felt a powerful urge to speak. Rising to his feet, he talked about the sorrows of slavery and the meaning of freedom. The audience was moved to tears. Soon, Douglass was lecturing across the United States and Britain. In 1847, he began publishing an anti-slavery newspaper, which he called the North Star. Question number 19. Who became the best-known African-American abolitionist? That is Frederick Douglass. Number 20. How did Frederick Douglass fight against slavery during his lifetime? Well, as a child, he defied the slave codes by learning how to read. Number 2, he escaped slavery in 1838. Number 3, he spoke out against the horrible nature of slavery all across not just America, but also Britain. And in 1847, number 4, he created his own anti-slavery newspaper, the North Star. So he took a lot of actions against slavery. William Lloyd Garrison speaks out. The most outspoken white abolitionist was a fiery young man named William Lloyd Garrison. To Garrison, slavery was an evil to be ended immediately. In 1831, Garrison launched The Liberator, the most influential anti-slavery newspaper. On the first page of the first issue, Garrison revealed his commitment. Primary source, William Lloyd Garrison, The Liberator, January 1831. I will be as harsh as truth and as uncompromising as justice. I am in earnest. I will not excuse. I will not retreat a single inch, and I will be heard. Question number 21. Who became the most outspoken white abolitionist? That was William Lloyd Garrison. Question 22. What actions did William Lloyd Garrison take to fight against slavery during his lifetime? Well, he spoke out against it and said it must be ended immediately. And with that, he launched his own newspaper, the most influential anti-slavery newspaper at the time, The Liberator. And question 23, what was The Liberator? That was the most important, influential anti-slavery newspaper in America. A year later, Garrison helped to found the New England Anti-Slavery Society. Members included Theodore Weld, a young minister and follower of Charles Grandison Finney, who had preached against slavery. Weld brought the energy of religious revival to anti-slavery meetings. So now we can answer question 24. What actions did Theodore Weld take to fight against slavery? Well, he preached against slavery with a certain amount of excitement and zest and vigor. The Grimke sisters contribute to reform. Angelina and Sarah Grimke were the daughters of a South Carolina slaveholder. Hating slavery, they moved to Philadelphia to work for abolition. Their lectures drew large crowds. Some people, including other abolitionists, objected to women speaking out in public. Whatsoever it is morally right for a man to do, replied Sarah Grimke, it is morally right for a woman to do. As you will see, this belief helped spark a movement for women's rights. Question 25. How did Angelina and Sarah Grimke fight against slavery? Well, first of all, because they didn't like it, they moved away from slavery in South Carolina to Philadelphia, where they fought for the cause of abolitionism. And 26. How did Angelina and Sarah Grimke help the women's rights movement? Well, they said, hey, we have the right to speak against slavery just as much as a man does. And that sort of also started the fight for freedom for women as well, for equal rights for women too. Well, thank you very much for watching. I do have a joke for you about freedom. Do you want to hear a freedom knock-knock joke? There are no freedom knock-knock jokes because freedom rings. Thank you and have a nice day.